Hello and welcome to RIVE, Reflections in Veterinary Education. This is a journal club episode, and Erik is going to be leading it for us. So, Erik, take it away.
Yeah, thanks. So I hope this is not self-indulgent. It's not intended to be, but I have two of my papers, and I think my ego is okay if you guys end up ripping them to shreds. But honestly, Bobby put this idea in my head. I think that you actually were talking about doing these, and I was like, oh yeah, okay, let's do that.
Yeah, I had come across the one in the most not that long ago in a JVME article, and I was like, oh, I really like this. And then later, I was like, oh, oh, perfect. We should do a journal club with one of the authors. Like, I actually think that's a great way to do a journal club is to talk to one of the people who is involved. So not self indulgent at all, and probably like all journal clubs should be this way. Get one of the
That's a
authors
really
to answer
interesting
questions.
idea.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll explain it in the way that makes sense to me. Um, so during my master's in sport pedagogy, one of the classes was like a literature class. We just read a bunch of stuff. And one of the articles that we read was a means end analysis into student athletes' decisions about where to go for their athletic career, basically,
Hmm.
what college to go to. And so I was fascinated by this for a number of reasons. One, it's a decision consideration that's really important for a lot of professions, like where are you going to go to school? What are you going to do with your life? And then their methodology that they used. So they called it a means end analysis. And it's basically like, what are the means that you're taking to get to this end? And they used a laddering interview technique where basically they just keep asking why until
Mhm.
they get to like core values. And they had a really nice way of illustrating it and everything. I'm like, this is cool. This sounds like a neat methodology. And I just was like, I want to do this just for the method.
Oh, cool.
Um, and so then I had a summer student. And the way I usually approach my summer students is like, hey, here's some ideas. Which of these sound interesting to you? And then let's go with that. And so this is what she was interested in, and I was like, okay, great. Find some seniors, interview them, try to get down to like core, beliefs about their values, um, and then we'll analyze it.
I love it. Well, the first thing I want to comment on, I don't think there's enough of the I read an article and I think it was like the research was well done and it's a methodology that I want to try to replicate, either exactly the same or like for my own purposes. There's so much emphasis on innovation and we got to do something brand new. And it's like actually in science, we need to have more robust results on these types of things. Or again, just like following in someone's footsteps is a great way to improve your ability to do that thing and to grow with it. So like regardless of the discipline or what the topic is, I think that's just an underutilized a kind of approach to research of all kinds. So kudos for that, if nothing else, and there will be
Yeah,
more.
no, definitely. I actually really enjoyed the articles too because self-determination theory, it was a nice introduction for me because I'm actually helping to write a chapter in a textbook. And one of the things that we're writing about is self-determination theory. So it was a nice primer, as they would say in Britain. And I enjoyed it. So yeah, and I
Nice.
like the backstory. I think that is why we should have authors join us
You
for the journal.
know, yeah. I think that's a really good point, Bobby, about the, methods. Like so many papers, I read like a human article and I'm like, I'm just going to copy and paste,
Yep.
right? Just like sub in dog, cat, horse, whatever, and
Yep.
do the same thing. And I've gotten so many publications that way. I think I agree with you. There is overemphasis on innovation.
Yeah, I'm working with I'm collaborating with some colleagues in just that way. Like I read this article in Human Medical Education and I want to replicate it for us. And we're not doing it exactly the same because for some, certain things can't be replicated exactly, but that inspired the next thing. So let's figure out how we can do that.
Yeah,
Um, and
definitely.
I think it's when people are struggling, like I don't know what I want to do, or I don't have experience with this. Find the papers that you find interesting, and find something that is seems doable.
Yeah.
I think it's a great way. There's still a lot of work involved, right? So anybody who's ever done like reading someone's paper and replicating it is still very hard. You still have to go through your design and your like it's not like, oh, that's so like, it's still hard. But it's a great way to improve your skills and your confidence in doing these things. And so you start with a replication and then you build in like, okay, replication plus tweaks, and then eventually you can start thinking of your, but yeah, to start out with like, I'm going to come up with something no one's ever come up with. No, you're not. Like,
Yeah, exactly.
yeah, it's not how it works. And if you do, you're probably going to be terrible at it. And so why waste your energy on trying, the very first time something totally brand new when it's get your feet wet with a process that has some it's some evidence that it's going to work too. So yeah, I think that's a really great lesson, is to steal from as many other people as you can. And chances are you're going to
borrow.
Yeah.
Sure. I mean, I don't know. I don't pay for any of this, so maybe I don't give it back afterwards. But what you do is you attribute that. Like, chances are you're going to reference that in your article if you're like, okay, and here we reference the methods based on this. Like, so they are going to get some credit for it. So anyway, I love that.
Yeah, exactly. Like we reference this, yeah, NCAA Division II female athletes paper. Like, yeah, no one was getting that otherwise.
Yeah.
So I really like the methodology, and it's long been a curiosity of mine. Why do people do internships? Why do people do private practice when they graduate? I was very much one that as soon as I learned about internships, I think in like my second year, I'm like, oh yeah, I'm definitely doing that. And then I had some classmates who I was like, oh man, you would be an amazing, specialist. And they're like, I got kids, I got to go make money. And so I thought that is an interesting question, and I don't think had been explored very much. So we had basically a convenient sample of universities. I have sort of a small, I don't know, 5 or 6 person group of researchers that we've done some,
Hey, Eric,
educational research stuff together.
Sorry to interrupt, but I don't know if we've actually said the article, the title of the article yet.
Oh, no, we have not. Yeah.
Yes. We should do that. It'll probably be on the page, on the webpage,
Yeah,
but yeah,
I'll
for
put
those
it
of you that are
title.
listening, in a proper podcast. Yeah. Sorry.
No, thanks. Yeah, so this is full-time employment or postgraduate education, a means and investigation of 4th-year veterinary students.
Awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Bobby.
Yeah, and it was in JVME 2021, if that helps you find it. But yeah, that title should get you right where you want to be.
So we had a kind of a convenient sample of these 3 universities, Midwestern, Oklahoma, and Purdue, where we had contact, and then recruited students from those that would do these means and interviews. So, we had a transcript. We had our interview script, and again, with questions that were directed at getting at these values, but always with the vision of having follow-up why, why, really getting to core values where, asking why didn't really get you any more information. So my summer student went and did these interviews and asked them, are you interested in full-time employment, i.e. private practice, or are you going to do postgraduate education? So we kind of separated them in those two groups. And then as one does with interview data, transcribed the data, and then went through the analysis. And what doesn't come through in the paper is that the first time through, we did the analysis, and we were sit down and looking at all these themes and like putting it together. And as we were doing that, I was like, I think all of these might map to self-determination theory. We didn't actually a priori start out with that. Gotcha. But as we were going through the themes, I'm like, I think this is relatedness, and I think this is competence, and I think this is autonomy. And so we kind of went back with that lens and did the data analysis with that lens in place. So Catherine, as the qual expert among us, I think that's an application of grounded theory where we're using the data to figure out the theory to apply. But I also feel like a lot of these terms in qualitative research are not particularly well defined.
Yeah, so yes and no. So grounded theory has sort of evolved, but it was originally created to indicate that you basically did an analysis, a qualitative analysis, to inform creation of a new theory. So I think that that's evolved over the time to be like, oh yeah, you can just go in thinking nothing, and then the data will tell you what it needs to tell you, and that's grounded theory, and that's actually not a particularly accurate thing. So I say yes and no because yeah, it definitely informed the theory that you used, but it didn't necessarily create a new theory. So I think you could probably go either way.
So to dig into that a little bit more, then again, so you can have, in advance, like, I think we're going to use
Mhm.
this theory, like, you could have said we're going to use self-determination theory, and maybe that would have influenced the questions that you asked, that
Mhm.
it's possible that it had. But I could imagine somebody listening and being like, well, isn't it better to just kind of keep it open and then see what happens? And
Mhm.
then what do you call that? Like, because if it's not really grounded theory, because you're right, like you didn't develop a new theory, but you, without necessarily looking for self-determination theory in advance, you said that's where this seems to be mapping to. So like how, what, I don't know, how do you use, obviously you could also just describe what happened like you
Yeah.
did, but you know, you were going into it thinking it could be grounded, like we might come up with something that no one else has really, captured before, but it turns out we haven't discovered a completely new theory like this works pretty well. I don't know what process that would be.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely an inductive process, right? It's not a deductive process in that type of situation. And so that's why I say, I mean, you could make the argument that it was grounded theory because you didn't
Yeah.
go in with any preconceived ideas or any specific hypotheses, and you came out of it knowing, wow, this really matches up with self-determination theory and sort of adds to the theory. And so I think you can stretch it to the point where it's like, we didn't come up with a new theory, but we stretched self-determination theory to go, sort of apply to a different situation where it never been applied before. So when Erik, you say like a lot of the things in qualitative research aren't well defined, you're absolutely right. I mean, part of the reason I'm a discourse analyst is because you can use discourse analysis as a method, and you can also use it as a theory. And depending
Yeah.
on which one you choose and how it comes into play, it could be completely different. So yeah, it's squishy in the right sort of ways.
Yeah, and that there's nothing, that's okay.
Yeah,
Yeah, like that's part of the discovery, right? Like I
exactly.
don't know what we're going to find. That's why we're asking the question.
Yeah.
Um, because I guess you could also go into it thinking it's going to be a certain lens, and you're like, this doesn't fit. I mean, that isn't that going
Yeah.
to be partly how some new theories are, maybe you didn't go into it thinking grounded theory, but you're like, this isn't working. Like conceivably, you could have gone in thinking this is going to all fit with self-determination theory. And then you get these comments and you're like,
Mm.
this doesn't fit with this theory. And I either need to find a different one or develop a new one or expand on this one. Like you said, stretch it maybe even further. So I think it's really good to remember that like that's part of discovery.
Yeah.
Um,
My very first paper that I ever published in my doctoral studies, I actually used discourse analysis. Um, but my professor kept telling me, you just did such a nice job using grounded theory in your paper. And I was like, but I didn't use grounded theory, I used
Aw.
discourse analysis. So, you know, just
but you
another,
did a good job,
I
like
did a good job. So,
yeah. But yeah, just so people listening, if those listening haven't done a lot of this kind of research, it can be really intimidating, right? When you're
yeah.
like, well, which theory are you going to use? You're like, well, I don't know. And like,
And
okay,
you
so
don't
you
have to
pick
know.
one, and that's okay. Sometimes you don't have to know, and even if you think it might not end up working out that way, and that's okay. There's still very likely something valuable to contribute here.
Yep.
So yeah, I think it's a good reminder. But I think it's really cool, Erik, that you kind of went in and you're like, wait a minute, this is seeming very clear. Cool. I mean, that's awesome. I love it.
Yeah.
Yeah. It probably doesn't hurt that I see, like, I am a self-determination theory, like hardcore. Like
Yeah.
that's how I see the world.
Yeah.
So I
A lot of the
obviously,
motivation theories, that one, because there's multiple pieces of it, I think that helps a
yeah,
lot, right? Because I don't think motivation is very one dimensional. And so I think it's a nice way of describing some discrete concepts that I think a lot of us can relate to at various times without being so narrow. You're like, well, sometimes it's this and sometimes it's that.
Yeah.
So I do think of a lot of the motivation theories that are out there. It's one of the more broadly encompassing theories, which makes it attractive. But maybe that's worth going into that a little bit.
Yeah,
Um,
for sure. I mean, so this is classically pioneered by DC and Ryan. If you DECI and Ryan, you'll come right up on any Google search. And the premise is that there's two major conceptions. One is there's a scale from amotivation to internal motivation. And there's kind of stages along there that you go where amotivation is you don't want to do anything. And internal motivation is you want to do it because you just want to do it. Nothing external to you is motivating you. And then there's these three domains of autonomy, competence, and relatedness. So autonomy is you get to decide, your own fate and what you do. Competency is you get better at stuff. Relatedness is your social engagement with people, and that you can kind of move, along the way from amotivation to internal motivation, depending on how these three things interact.
Or
So
from internal motivation to amotivation, depending on.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah. And I mean, there's just like so many applications for this in education, but the one that I love is like, how can we give students more internal motivation? How can we make them want to do this thing? And there's easy things to do, like with autonomy, give them a choice of assignments,
Yep.
give them a choice of topics, right? Like these are low-hanging fruit things that we can do. Competence is you think like competence is built in, but sometimes students don't see what they're learning. So
Right.
just making that explicit for them, like, look how far you've come, and then get them excited about learning. And the relatedness piece, obviously they're basically in high school again. So, it's this weird social dynamic. And this is a little bit harder to manipulate potentially, but, group work can lead in a positive direction, but it could also be amotivating for like highly, solitary people. So I'm like, if you want to work with a group, great. If you don't want to work with a group, great. Like,
There's some more
again,
autonomy
autonomy.
there.
Yeah.
Love it.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think it's just helpful to kind of review that really briefly. That was great.
Yeah. And anything to add, Catherine or Bobby, your perceptions of SDT?
No, I actually don't. I'm not as familiar with SDT because it's just not, I'm not an educational psychologist, but I do find motivation and the question of it really interesting because one of the things that we talked about a lot during my master's program was this idea that everybody's like, well, we just need to pay our teachers more. Then we would get better teachers and they would stay longer. And then you would read the research and it's like, actually pay is not even in the top 10 list of things that motivate people to be teachers, right? It's like many of the things that you've talked about, like this ability to make their own decisions, this ability to have a decent life, to build relationships, like all of these things. And money is like so far down on the ladder. And so I think motivation is one of those things that's really sticky to understand, but it's so important. And people just make assumptions about motivation that are so inaccurate, which is also really interesting to me, right? Like that we make these assumptions that like, oh, because there's all these studies in psychology too about like, well, we offered $50 to psychology students to take this, to participate in this survey or whatever. And we actually got less engagement from them than the ones that we just basically said, do you want to take this survey? And actually the more they increase the money, the fewer people actually want it. So like, it's totally counterintuitive, but anyway, so yeah,
motivation theory is actually really, really fascinating. And
yeah.
And I did take an entire ed psych course on motivation, and Erik kind of talked a little bit about like intrinsic motivation, like what is in me that wants to do these things versus the external motivators for like getting paid for something. And I think that's what makes motivation so fun, is how complex it is, right? It's not one thing. And I think we've all experienced that. Sometimes I'm motivated by this, and sometimes I just want to do it because it's fun or I enjoy it, or I have this, like I want to be better at this.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are lots of different motivation theories, and you'll see, some of the theories have similar things about them. And I'll just do this one quick plug, but one of the ed psych faculty at Virginia Tech, who's one of my mentors, does actually quite a bit of research on motivation, and he's come up with what he calls the music model. And it's kind of like motivation theory for dummies. That's a little unfair, but basically it's music is an acronym that he's sort of taking all of the different theories and saying, here, let me pare it down to the basic things that regular people who don't have a degree in this can understand. And so music, M stands for empowerment. So you got to ignore the E, but so for that autonomy, which is part of self-determination theory and some other theories. And then U is usefulness. Is this going to be useful for me? Which you could argue gets into some competence in SDT. S is success. Do I think I can do this? Like, can I be successful at this? I is for interest. is this interesting? Is this fun? Is this something I enjoy? And then C is the caring. So like the relatedness piece. And so it's not perfect, but it's a nice, like simple, like mental checklist that I can do. Like you said, Eric, like what are the low hanging fruit? So if anybody's interested, you can go to themusicmodel.com, and he's got like a ton of stuff and literature and things like that. It's actually really, really cool stuff. So for like a primer on motivation theory, at any rate, so plug for Brett Jones.
Yeah. I've
And
got, Catherine, what you were saying about, paying people. This is a book that I really like. It's called Punished by Rewards,
Oh, wow.
by Alfie Kohn. What is this? 400 pages of just study after study where paying people and giving them kudos and all that nonsense does nothing.
yeah,
Which is so interesting because our entire educational system in the United States is based on rewards and
I mean,
punishments.
our entire capitalistic
Yeah,
society is
it's
based on that
like,
premise.
and then
Yeah.
we wonder why our students are frustrated when we ask them to do something that doesn't give them a reward. You know, it's
Yep.
like they've literally been trained since kindergarten. If you do the right thing and you find the right answer, you're going to get a good grade and you're going to get this reward or you're going to get that. And if you don't, then you're going to fail and you might get held back or you might not get into the school you want to get into. And then they get into vet school and people are wondering like, why are our students so competitive? Why are our students grade grubbing? Why are our students so worried about every half of a point? Why are and it's like, because that's what we've taught them is important. If we had taught them what was important was internal motivation and the desire to do things that they found interesting. And in order to do all of the things they find interesting, they sometimes have to do things they don't find interesting. Maybe it would be different, but
it's so freeing when you get to that point, though, right? When you
it
get
is.
to the point where you can just choose because you're like, I like this.
Yeah,
I enjoy this. This is interesting to me. This I feel like this will be useful for me.
yeah.
Which is where like I think any motivation theory that doesn't include some piece of autonomy is missing out because I do think that's really important. Like, but what's important for me, because we're not all the same, and so what
Right.
motivates me is not going to motivates the next person. So having some choice, I think, is really really important. But at any rate, we could make this whole podcast about motivation. Um, but yeah, so I love that. I think getting into a little bit of self-determination theory, and if somebody is like reading this or listening to this and finds this there's a lot of good stuff out there to kind of help. But motivation is complex for sure. I think even internally we can understand that. Like, I don't know exactly all the time what's motivating. Today I'm motivated and tomorrow I'm not, and why
Yeah.
is that? So but I think the way you approach, the writing of this and like the summarizing and how you broke down the, what you got from the responders was really nice in the way it was kind of organized to weave that together for somebody who isn't familiar with, self-determination theory. But I think it still like makes sense. You don't have to be well versed in STT for this to get it, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. So we did something, maybe grounded theory, maybe adjacent to it. And then looking at managing bias, we did a member check. So we shared with the interviewees their transcript as well as the domains that we identified and just were like, hey, does this seem, consistent with the intent that you were wanting to communicate?
It's great.
So we got 21 students from the different institutions. 9 of them responded to the member check and thought that what we had identified were reasonable. And so then we split them into the full-time employment students and the postgraduate education students. And just to summarize the outcome, because it was super clear, and I'm a little surprised at how clear the data was on a certain level, that those who were interested in full-time employment had more of the autonomy pieces that they were interested in than the postgraduate education students. And then for the competence, the postgraduate education students had a lot more of those than the full-time employment students. And then for relatedness, it was pretty mixed. They both were interested in relatedness. And so it was so remarkable to be looking at the data and seeing how it was all following along. It's like, it all makes sense. Like, it's all like what you would think would be
Yeah.
what people are deciding is what they're using to decide.
Yeah. I think that I have a couple of things highlighted, and so that was really interesting to me. But I think what really hit me sort of most in the gut was in your introduction when you said, in a survey of veterinary interns, 82% indicated that encouragement from clinical faculty was the most influential factor in their applying for an internship. I mean, that's huge. That right there talks about the impact in a very nice sentence that a single educator can have on somebody's entire life. Like that's huge. And I was like, I wasn't blown away by the number per se, but it was just nice to see in black and white that that was the case. And
That's
I
a pretty big
realized,
number though. Like that.
I mean, well, I mean, and I realize the N is small, but still that's huge. 82%, right? Like that's a big deal. And if people aren't reading that and going, I can really have an impact on a student just by having a conversation and encouraging someone, then they're missing out because that's huge. So I loved that. But I do wonder if that is because, I don't know, I think there's a lot of things you could unpack there too, right? Like faculty sort of weasel out the people that they sort of view as the types of people that are more motivated by that competence versus autonomy, or is that, you know, like, even though they maybe don't have the language for it or whatever.
But also, what percentage of students who didn't go on to postgraduate education had a faculty member reach out to them and suggest it? Because I've definitely had students that I've reached out and been like, hey, you know, have you thought about this? You don't want to like pressure them and make them feel bad for not doing it. But like, if this is something you're interested in, I think, you know, it's something to consider. And I've had them not do that. And that's, you know, so it does, I'd be curious, is there a difference in percentage and what's the, you know, is that, are they more likely to do it? 82% is a pretty high number to think that
it is a big number,
and that they're reporting this influenced my decision. But you know, like you said, is that faculty are maybe just subconsciously even identifying, you know, good at identifying the students who would be receptive to that. But yeah, it is fascinating. But I think you're right, underscores the importance of us having conversations, not just about you should do an internship, but like, hey, what are your goals? What do you want to do? And encouraging, you know, what they're already maybe wanting to do.
Yeah. I was also curious, and you probably can't figure this out, but I would be curious about, academic achievement in those groups, and if that had any, if there was any sort of clustering of individuals that were sort of closer to the top or the middle or the bottom. I mean, I know way too many people now that were definitely in the bottom half or bottom even third of their classes that went on to do residencies and were very successful and have become board certified. And I think it might be interesting to do that because I think it could really potentially blow open some of the biases that people have when they're selecting their, you know, interns and residents. It's like, oh, it's all about the grades. No, it's not all about the grades, because every student who's managed to make it through a veterinary program is probably going to be okay. You know, some of them may need a little more help than others, but they'll probably be fine. So
well,
anyway,
and how much of that, yeah, if you look into like what your results were here, Erik, that desire to improve one's competence, like I want to be better at this, and like I'm still struggling with these things, and so I recognize in myself that I would benefit from additional targeted mentorship and training that I think an internship can provide me. And so, yeah, like maybe we should be looking more at what are the motivations behind why somebody wants to do an internship. I don't know. I think it'd be cool to have these extra letters after my name. Not necessarily, you know,
which is okay. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that per se.
I think it is cool, but if that's the primary motivator, like on those hard days, I don't know if that's going to be enough.
Right.
Yeah, yeah, none of this, we didn't look at like how they got to this point. We were just looking at from this, now that you are the person that you are, what do you value for your future?
Yeah.
So that is an interesting point. Like how they get here.
Yeah. Do those motivations change? Because that's the other question I had when you were talking about that earlier. And they do, right? Like I think different points in our lives, we've all had different things that are a higher priority. And you know, what I also think is interesting, that maybe you can comment more on, Erik, but the relatedness was important to both groups and was a motivator for their decision in both groups. And so I thought, but like, so that's the interplay maybe between the others, like, you know, how does autonomy influence relatedness, and how does autonomy influence competence, and how do competence and autonomy influence like how you perceive relatedness? So I don't know if you had any kind of thoughts on that when you were digging through.
I mean, the thing that struck out is the ones that were very lopsided one way or the other. So for example, family, friends, and social life, we put that in relatedness because I think that's where it makes sense. But that was mentioned by all of the full-time employment students, and or not all of them, but 8 out of 11, and none of the postgraduate
Okay.
education students.
Yeah.
So, and there again, it's like, what's the chicken and egg? Like, do they already have a family? And so they're focusing on how that is motivating their behavior. Um, so that was one that was pretty lopsided. And then another that was lopsided was the trusted and valued by colleagues, whereas the postgraduate education students seem to have that as more than the full-time employment. So I mean, I guess it speaks to, it is complicated, right? It's not any one thing, but like you say, there is an interplay among these.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm curious too about both of you, because both of you are both board certified specialists, right? And I am not. And as I was reading through this paper, I was like, yeah, that's me. Like I was 35 when I graduated vet school. I had already had a career. I was not happy about living like a poor college student, and I was not going to go give give more of my labor and hard-earned time on earth for a very paltry salary and all those things. And so I was very motivated by getting out, getting a job, being able to pay my student loans and live like a normal human adult. So I was like, yeah, I definitely see that. And if I had been part of the study, probably would have come out pretty clearly. So I'm curious about the two of you, if you had that experience as you were writing and doing the article, or Bobby, as you were reading it.
Yeah, I was squarely in that competence column. Like when I think about what was motivating me. Yeah, I mean, I graduated, I was single, I was, didn't have children, didn't have immediate plans to have children or anything like that. Was like, I'm at a good point in my life where I can do these things. But really what drove it was the desire, like, I want to be good at this.
Mm.
And I want to set myself up for a scenario where I can be around the people who can ensure I will be good at this. And I originally thought that was still going to be private practice. And I don't know if I've shared this on this podcast before, but I was not planning on doing an internship or a residency. I was doing a private practice externship. And the owners of that practice, we were chatting about, like, what are my goals? What do I want to do? And it was a really good, high end, practicing good quality medicine, the kind of practice I want to work at. And they're like, we don't hire new grads. And I'm like, what? Why not? And they're like, provide the mentorship that a new grad needs. So we either hire somebody who's done an internship or has 3 to 5 years of experience. And I was like, well, if I can cram 3 to 5 years of experience in a 1-year internship and that will elevate my abilities, heck yeah. And so that was the big driver for me. And then the reason to do the residency was during the internship, having a case. Like I was moving along, feeling pretty good about myself. Like I'm doing pretty well, and I'm feeling like a reasonably competent and confident veterinarian. And then a case came in and made me feel real like I've never even heard of this syndrome, and I still have a lot to learn. And I did not like that feeling. And I said, I guess it's time to learn more. And so very much my experiences and my drivers fell nice and I think neatly into that competence column. How
Yeah,
about you?
exactly the same. I mean, I want to be a student. If I could just be a professional student for the rest of my life, that would be great. And professor is the closest I could get. So, and I think that's all competence. Like I'm all about skill acquisition. Like if I could just spend my whole life doing skill acquisition, that sounds awesome.
Oh,
Now, see,
same.
I would actually be a professional student as well. I
Yeah.
just don't like taking tests, and I don't like being like under the constant pressure of having to prove myself. And so because I think I had done that for so long, and I continue to do that just generally in my daily life anyway, that I was just like, no, I don't want to have to do
You're
that.
describing the autonomy piece though.
Yeah, 100%. 100%.
So funny. Yeah.
It makes me think in my sports pedagogy program, I had a class about research methods. And I was like, I could teach this class. I literally do teach this class now.
Yeah.
But I sat through it and I was like, I mean, this is what I got to do, and I'll try to find what I can to learn from it. But yeah, that autonomy piece was just like crushed. It's like, no, you're taking this class.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So
That's really
again, like I think Erik and I both like desire autonomy and choice in our lives.
Of course.
And you obviously desire, you want to continue to learn and get good at things. Like, so it's not an either or. But like when I made that decision, what was the thing that pushed me in that? It was definitely that. And so I think it's more of a in the moment, and then how are these options perceived, right? Like, so if I like, that's the other thing, like how much of it is I made this choice. And then after the fact, like, these are the reasons why, you know, I think that's really fascinating too with motivation. Cause I also talk to students, and I'm sure you both do too, about like, trying to figure this out is really hard.
Yeah.
I have conversations with students all the time, and that'll start coming up again in a few months where they're like trying to say, do I apply for an internship? Do I not?
Mhm.
And we have these conversations about like, what are your top goals? Like, what are the things that are most important to you? And it's
Yeah.
funny because the things that came up in this article are the same things that, you know, that come up in the conversations I have with students. And at the end of the day, like, they're all talking about all of these things, like but what rises to the top for you right now?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think it's really fascinating. And I think it's important to remember that that can change over time, right? Like, right now, this is my top priority, but 5 years from now, it might be very different. And guess what? Veterinary medicine is really cool because you can change.
Or it might be exactly the same. I am
That's okay too.
very much still an autonomous person. I talk about wanting to take classes because, like, when I was at Virginia, Maryland, right, I could take all these classes for free. Didn't sign up for one of them because I was like, no, I don't want to do that to myself, you know?
Yeah.
But I did order myself a math book because I want to get better at math. And so I have this little math book that I'm going to start to study at home because I can do that on my own time in my own way. So,
You sound
yeah,
exactly like my husband. He's like, yeah, I like learning all this stuff, but like, I can just read that in the book and teach myself.
exactly.
I'm like, I mean, I guess you can, but
So that kind of is one of the key takeaways, Bobby, that I kind of had from this paper was when I'm having those conversations. Now I feel like I can guide like their values a little bit more clearly, and be like, okay, like what really matters to you, and do it shorthand, right? Instead of doing like a 15-minute interview, like getting their core values, I can be like, hey, do you like learning stuff? Do you like getting better at stuff? Great. Do you want to be able to do your own thing? Do you care about money? Great. You know?
Done.
Because actually, in
Done.
my head, I had this idea that Erik is setting up, like, you know, you're scheduling meetings with students, and then you bring out the interview questions. You're like, right, question one.
No, that's not Erik.
Yeah.
That's funny. Although I will have to
Um,
say that there have been times in my life, even now, like, I do want the autonomy, but I also am like, man, if I could do an internship in a residency at this point, right? I've got 13 years of clinical practice. I don't need you to do an internship.
Shouldn't have to do
I'm
it.
like, I would totally do clinical pathology in a heartbeat, you know? Like, I
You
think that would
still
be so.
can, just saying. Those doors are
No, I know, but then I'd have to like actually be somewhere and somebody wants me to be there.
yeah.
I'd get paid a lot, you know, a lot less than I get paid now. I'd have to feel like I was stupid again. Like, I just don't know if I want to do that to myself. But
Okay, any other comments on this so that we have time for the other one?
Yeah, really quickly, just another thing I wanted to point out again. So for people who are less familiar with qualitative research, it was really nice the way you shared. Here's the brief overview, but gave those exemplars, right? Here's the paragraph that really we think this was a nice response that, you know, in their own words, right? You're hearing from the actual interviewees what they said, and that gives me as the reader an opportunity to kind of check and be like, okay, yeah, I see why you rated it this way. That makes sense to me, and it provides that extra clarity. So it's a common thing with qualitative research, but if you're not used to that and you're like, when are all these little block quote? Yeah, yes, that's how this goes. But I do think it adds to sort of the richness of the article. It makes it, for me, just like a little more fun to read, like to hear those direct quotes, but does also kind of enhance the story you're telling, and provides that, you know, kind of full picture. So just something I think is worth, you know, pointing out, because we don't read or talk about nearly as much qualitative research. So those listening may not be as familiar with that.
yeah, I actually cringe when I read qualitative papers that don't do that because it doesn't give the reader an opportunity to really sort of solidify, you know, the reasoning. So I agree with you 100% on that, Bobby.
Yeah. Well
Yeah,
done.
and I kind of forgot until you mentioned that, you know, we have examples of from the full-time employment students and from the postgraduate students. So you can see the quality of the response.
Yeah.
That it's like, okay, we're putting this under freedom to practice your own medicine as the domain, and you can see how each of them take the approach to that domain.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Definitely.
no, I think that's a really important piece when you're writing about these types of things, is to sometimes just quote the actual people.
Yeah.
You know, don't make me read through all of it, right? Like,
Right.
but give me some good exemplars that drive that point home. So I think that's a really helpful thing to do. The other thing I would say that I appreciated about this article is that you didn't try to claim too much, right?
Hmm.
Which I think is another nice thing about social science and education research in general. It's like, okay, let's stay in our lane. This is what we can learn from this. This doesn't need to be some sweeping, we've, changed everything there is about all of this, or like, here you go. And even though like this matches, maybe like it makes a lot of sense. That's helpful stuff. Like you said,
Yeah.
it can frame the conversations we have with our students, which is awesome. So
Yep.
I really enjoyed
Cool.
it. Well done.
Okay. So we had those results, and those were in 21 students. And so then I wondered, what is the external validity of these findings, right? So that, in qualitative research, we often dig deep into the data to find out the whys, but it doesn't really answer it for the population, which is what, quantitative data and inferential statistics are designed to do. So I thought, okay, we did this work, we've identified these domains. Could we do a survey that asked about how people feel about these domains? Um, One, to sort of like confirm the findings from the qualitative study, and then to get a larger group of data to make broader generalizations. So that was the second study, examination of motivational influences on clinical year veterinary students' career decisions. So the foundational, principle is the same, self-determination theory. We also included some personality and some practical considerations, because something that I always wonder is like, how much does indebtedness influence people's, decision making
Yeah.
with postgraduate education? So again, we had a kind of convenient sample of universities, um, 3 public universities and 1 private universities that we recruited students from for this survey. And we basically built the survey on the grounds of the qualitative study. And so I'm curious, Catherine, I think this is an example of mixed methods where we did a qual project and then we did a quant project, and they share like a theoretical framework.
Yep. Exactly.
Because I know some people will do like, they'll have like a survey and they'll ask like an open-ended question that'll be like qualitative. And they're like, we did a mixed methods analysis. I'm like, I mean, kind of. But I think we've talked about before on the podcast that having them have their own separate projects.
Really
Yeah.
nice. And I think that I like that. I know some researchers are very like anti-qual or anti-mixed methods. Um,
Yes.
and I think that is fair when they're trying to mix it into one paper. I think that sometimes it can muddy it, but I think doing it the way you did, where either the qualitative results inform the quantitative or vice versa, right? Because the
Mhm.
other can happen. You could have started with the quant and then said, hey, let's dig more into this. And so that's where I think for me, mixed methods can really shine, is when you use one to sort of, elaborate on or enhance the other.
Yeah, I had a psychology. She had a PhD in psychology and was very much a quantitative researcher, and then came over to the education side and became very much a qualitative researcher. She was actually my qual instructor, and she was very much anti-mixed methods. And the reason she was anti-mixed methods was because generally when 1 or 2 people, unless one person is a quantitative researcher and one person is a qualitative researcher, they don't do either of them well. And then oftentimes what happens is that you have 2 or 3 quantitative researchers who think they're doing qualitative research, but really all they're doing is quantifying qualitative results. And so that's why she was against it, because it does muddy the waters, but also there's just a lack of ability to do either one very well if you're trying to put both of them into the same article. So yeah, if you pull them apart, then you're still doing mixed methods. You're doing exactly what Bobby said. They're informing each other. So
Yeah, so we built the survey with the Big Five um, test for personality determination, and then self-determination things. And then we also were looking at impact of social influence, since we did identify relatedness was kind of split, and then demographics, income, etc. So I'll pause there. Any questions, thoughts on the intro methods?
No, I think for me, I struggle a little bit like with what to do with that, like I don't know, all of those personality tests are so tricky
Mhm.
because they either have to be so involved and cumbersome that nobody will do them, or, like I just think about like breaking down my or anyone's personality into those things. I just think that's always really tough. So whenever I see that, I'm like, I don't know. And then I keep reading. I'm like, I think maybe I'm like a qualitative researcher.
You might very well be.
But anyway, so that's the only thing that makes me go, I understand the reasons that you do it, but I'm just like, it's really hard to, break a person down into that type of, so I'm always like, how much is that going to change? And I know it's been validated, but like, if you ask me in 3 years or like tomorrow, or when I'm on clinics versus when I'm off clinics, like how different are those things going to be? Anyway.
I mean, I think it depends on the person. I have done my MBTI at multiple times in my life over multiple decades, and it's always exactly the same. So, but for some people it does change, so I think it's a legitimate question, but it is kind of interesting, I think, because I think a lot of people have looked into that. So
Yeah,
it is. It's definitely interesting. I just think you got to be careful with how you apply it.
Well, I also think there's a lot of assumptions about veterinarians as a whole, or physicians as a whole, right? All veterinarians are tree hugging introverts who just want to save the world, which is not necessarily true. And, could be a really boring.
Yeah, we're not all type A. We're not.
Everybody was exactly the same. So anyway.
Yeah. So on to the results. So we had about 500 distributions and about 35% response rate. In terms of differences, so we separated them out between those who are interested in full-time employment, i.e. private practice, those who are interested in postgraduate education. Not surprisingly, there was a difference in expected salary, but somewhat surprisingly, there was no difference in their reported student loan debt. Both groups had about $160,000 in student loans with a pretty broad range. So that was one data point that was a little bit surprising. But later on, we'll get into maybe that's a little bit fuzzy. Didn't find anything with personality, which not terribly surprising. And then external factors, the ones that were particularly interesting. So teacher or mentor, to your point, Catherine, about the previous study, those who are interested in postgraduate education said that was a higher influence. And then debt and finances were higher for those who are interested in full-time employment. So even though their numbers weren't higher, that was a greater influence on their decision-making. And so I don't know if, they had more anxiety about that debt, or there was some interaction going on there that's kind of interesting. And we didn't get, the ability to explore. And then location was also weighed more importantly by the full-time education or the full-time employment students than the education students. So the education students are like, yeah, whatever, ship me off to, Saskatoon, and it'll be frozen north for 9 months out of the year. But those who are interested in being private practicing, like they weighted that more heavily location-wise. So thoughts on those data?
I wonder, Eric, because I'm looking at your table 1 descriptive data of respondents' age, anticipated income, and approximate debt at completion of their training. The postgraduate education age range was 24 to 31. And the full-time employment age range was 23 to 40. Now their medians were almost exactly the same, but I wonder if maybe some of that has to do with a little bit older age range. And maybe those older folks in the sort of 32 to 40 age category are a little bit more outliers. But I certainly fell into that age range. And as we've already discussed, like I wanted to pay back my student loans because I didn't like being in debt, and all those things. And so it might not have been statistically significant, especially based on the mean and median, but I did kind of wonder about that. And then I have to say, I like cringed at the range of like $0 to $600,000. Like, oh my gosh.
Yeah, I'll be honest, that 0 really upsets me. I'm like, so
yeah, right.
but
so I can't, like, I had 140 when I graduated, and I was a little overwhelmed, but I cannot imagine graduating with
I have more than that still right now. Anyway, so it's funny, Eric, that you said you were surprised that there wasn't a difference, and I was not surprised. And again, I'm looking at it through my own lens because, I came out of school with over $250,000 of debt, and I was like, whatever, it's a drop in the bucket at this point. That's such a big number. I like, it didn't matter. Like it
Right.
didn't matter.
It's like 250,000, 800,000. I'm
yeah.
never going to pay it off. I might as well
Like
just.
those numbers are just so big that it's irrelevant. And I'm not saying that's a good financial like perspective to have. That's not what I'm encouraging. And I probably could have and should have made smarter choices, but then maybe I wouldn't be a vet. So I really wasn't surprised by that because that is how I approached it. I was like, okay, well, I have all this massive debt. So if I start paying it off now and it takes me 30 years, or I start paying it off in 4 years and it takes me 30 years, oh, okay. So I'm done at 64 instead of 60, like whatever.
Yeah.
That to me did, and I've literally used that phrase, it's a drop in the bucket at this point, again, probably making anybody with like, financial savvy cringe, but that's what I had to do to get through because, yeah, that's just what it is.
Well, and I do wonder about that too, right? Because I think that having taught a class of students and having asked them to do a budget and realizing how many of them really don't understand money at all in any way, shape, or form. Like I agree, Bobby. I was surprised, but at the same time, now I reflect on like the students and the experience that I had with them doing a budget. And I'm like, well, maybe I shouldn't be surprised because I don't think they just don't recognize it. And again, that's why I wonder if maybe that age range has something to do with it, even though the median was the same, because as a 35-year-old coming out of vet school, I immediately felt like I was 10 years behind everybody else. And I was like, I don't want to be in debt. I've got to figure out how to pay this off. Going into an internship and a residency, even if I desperately wanted to do it, the practical side of me wouldn't have allowed myself to do that because I needed to pay off my debt. And so, but I also, again, was about 10 years older than most people that I graduated
Yeah.
with and was 10 years behind and had 10 years more experience out in life and having to live paycheck to paycheck and those kinds of things. So,
and I think as part of it too, like one, there had to be some degree of denial for me in order to fathom, like you have to just go like, that's a thing. That's a tomorrow problem. And because what else can I do? Right. But you're right. Some of that is age for sure. But again, like, I mean, my student loans still cost more than my mortgage right now, like today.
Yeah.
So, and I remind my husband, I'm worth more dead than alive still.
I used to say that to my husband too.
My student loans don't go under his debt. Like he's not responsible.
That's right.
But, so I
have a
challenge.
friend who was telling a story of someone that they knew who this person is just like an insurance adjuster, like they make $50,000 a year or something. And they were telling me that they were like flying to Orlando to buy a $20,000 Vera Wang dress for their wedding, and just like all of this like nonsense extravagance. And my wife was like, "This is an Erik ghost story. Like this is how you give Erik nightmares, is telling stories like this. You got to stop."
Yeah, I remember, and I think I may have told us before, we had a financial planner who came in and gave us like this financial planning conversation about, smart borrowing. And I think it was like first or second year or whatever. And he would tell us a story about this couple that were going through vet school together. And they came up to him after one of these seminars that he'd given out of vet school. And they were like, because he would offer like one free, consulting time or whatever. And they were like, yeah, we'd really like to make an appointment with you. We're both graduating with student loan debt and we'd like to kind of talk to you about the best way to pay it off. And he was like, okay. And he's like, well, about how much debt are you guys going to have? And they're like, we're going to have about $500,000 of student loan debt, combined by the time we graduate. And he was like, okay, well, we can definitely sit down and talk about that. I have time next week. And they're like, oh no, we can't go meet with you next week because we're going on a cruise to do for 10 days or whatever. And he's just basically like, yeah, I don't know that
I can help you.
I can't help you.
Oh, see, but so I was going to comment because you said something earlier, Catherine. I think the other thing that for me made the, going into postgraduate education more viable was like, I'm a student. I'm living off of student loans. I have this much money that I get at the beginning of the semester and it dwindles and dwindles and I have to budget very carefully. And so I wasn't even living paycheck to paycheck. I was living loan check to loan check.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And so like I'm eating mac and cheese and ramen and I'm not, and I was like, I can just keep doing that. Like I haven't gotten a taste of the good life. Right. So where people who have done that, going back to if you told me I had to go back to that now, ooh, my motivations would be different. I do.
And that was me, right?
Yeah.
Because I mean, I had lived paycheck to paycheck and lived loan to loan, went back to living loan to loan when I was in vet
Yeah.
school. But, for 5 or 6 years before I went to vet school,
You
I
knew what it
wasn't
was like.
rich, but
Yeah.
I was making money and I
Yeah.
actually had a little savings and, all those things.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's much harder to go back to doing that.
Yeah.
So I do think and again, that may be part of the age and experience
Yeah.
thing.
And
But
so,
maybe it's less an age thing and
here.
more of an experience thing. So
Right. Right. So I
Yeah.
wonder how much is that, but that gives me some like some follow-up questions. Now we got to go and do another qualitative study after that.
So then the last part was these 19 factors that we had previously identified related to self-determination theory domains. And lo and behold, it pretty much fell out the same way that the qualitative results did, which was surprising and cool.
It's always nice when
So,
that happens.
Yeah.
right? Yeah, generally the full-time employment students cared more about the autonomy pieces. The postgraduate education students cared more about the competence pieces. They both cared about relatedness, with the distinct difference, which again was from the qualitative study, of family, friends, and social life being weighted higher by the full-time employment. So that was again surprising and neat, where it's like, okay, great, we found this data from our subset of 21 students in their qualitative, and now we've got it from 100, 70 students, and it's kind of reinforced the data that we found.
It was interesting though, because I was just scanning down, and it was interesting that over half of the students said that they had decided what they were going to do before they even went to vet school,
Yeah.
which I was kind of surprised by, actually.
Yeah. But you know what I think that means? I think that means they thought they knew what they wanted to do and they happened to not change. I mean, because I
Maybe.
thought what I wanted to do and then I changed and I was like, I guess I didn't know. But you know what I mean? So like, I don't know if that means they were more decisive or just like how many of them came in with just what they thought it was going to be and just nothing changed their minds. I, I, I know that seems very similar, but to me, it is a
No,
little.
I know what you're saying. Yeah. I think that's very possible. Or they were just stubborn and they were like, no,
Yeah,
I knew what I was going to do and
probably
I'm
some of
going to
that.
do it. And I don't care what happens. I don't care that I actually really love surgery. I'm going to be an internist, like there
Yeah.
are people like that. So
There are people that I wonder about that. Like, did you just decide this? But like, maybe this isn't really for you. But
yeah.
yeah, I don't know. I have a question about like statistical analyses when it comes to these types of things. And Erik, I'd be curious to kind of get your perspective on this. But when you have like a Likert type scale, right, where you're saying rate this from, strongly agree to whatever, blah, blah, blah. When we're doing that, like I struggle with the, averaging those, like putting means and things together, because is the difference between a 4 and a 5 really the same as the difference between a 3 and a 4? And like, can we really measure and quantify that? And so it's a question. I know it's really common, but like mathematically, I have a really hard time wrapping my brain around this. And I don't mean that like, oh, we can't make meaning out of this, but I wonder a little bit what what impact that might have on how we look at this type of data. I'm curious your thoughts.
So one of the interesting things about a traditional statistics education is that I had to do all of these analyses by hand once upon a time. So I know like what it looks like on inside the box. And with the Mann-Whitney U, it's a ranking based of the data. So you basically put all the data and then you line it up according to the number, like the order of the numbers, and then you like compare the two groups, is the simplistic way to explain that. So the median and the mean values aren't per se meaningful. It's more like where the ranks fall between those two groups. So when you see a statistically significant difference, it basically means that there were more lower order items in this group than higher, and there are more high order items in this group, is kind of how I would interpret that significant result.
That makes sense to me. But I guess like when I look at like table 4, for example, and you have 4.2 plus or minus 1, but like nobody can answer 4.2. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I struggle sometimes to really get the meaning. So what you're saying is like there were more people who rated it this than this, and that statistic that I get. But I think it's like the 4.2 that my brain sort of gets like mushy around.
Yeah, I think that it's just there's a lot of ways to display the data, and that's just one way to do it. You could also do it visually. I think that it would just be a very busy graph or a lot of graphs to do so. So you're absolutely right that no one can put 4.3, and you're absolutely right that the difference between a 4 and a 5 is not the same as the difference between a 1 and a 2. It's ordinal data, which is rank based, but not, the difference between them is not set like it is for like body temperature,
Right.
age, where, those things. So the way that I would interpret that is looking basically at magnitude rather than absolute values.
Yeah.
And even then, I don't know that I would make that many remarkable conclusions. So for example, comfort and quality of life, 4.4 versus 3.0, and financial security, 4.3 versus 3.1.
Right.
Would I say, well, there's a bigger spread between comfort and quality of life than there is between financial security? I mean, numerically, that's a true statement, but on a practical level, it's meaningless.
Right. Right.
That's how I tend to
No,
interpret it.
and I think conceptually that makes sense. It's something I've asked a number of like, my professors too, and we talk about these things, and I'm like, and they're like, yeah, it's kind of messy and hard, and yeah.
Statistics, right?
What's that?
That's statistics. It's like
It
when
is.
people, they're like, oh, numbers don't lie. I'm like, well, yeah, they kind of do. And it depends on who's actually putting the numbers together and interpreting them and what kind of test they've decided to use. And
Well, like Erik said, there's an order. It's ordinal data. Like this
yeah,
one's clearly more than that one. But like we're sort of assigning numbers, and those numbers are again, they're not arbitrary. They are in an order, but like the numbers themselves don't mean anything
yeah,
other than to signify the order. And then we're also like trying to say, how motivated am I, and like what does that mean? So again, I'm not saying that these numbers don't mean anything and they tell us a story. It's just something I always struggle with when we have ordinal data like this.
Yeah.
And I think it's something a lot of people do, or they'll do the opposite where they'll just take it at face value and be like, yeah, 4.2, like what you said, and like, oh no, this one was more. No, we had
Yeah.
I think it's good to talk about it and point out like that this is not like traditional discrete, data. You have to be a little bit, or what am I trying to say? Continuous data.
Yeah.
So something to just keep in mind with these types of studies.
For sure. No, I thought it was great to have both of those articles. And I also think it's a great way to demonstrate the value of both qualitative and quantitative papers, right? Because if you had just the quantitative material, you might think something different versus if you have the qualitative material. And in this particular case, it was nice that your results ended up lining up, but sometimes they don't line up, and you wouldn't know that if you only did one piece of that methodology. So I thought it was really nicely done, and I actually really enjoyed both of them.
It does beg the question, like, is there something we're missing, right? Are there questions we're not asking? And if you had somebody who was like, a hardcore, like for a different motivation theory, would they come in and be like, well, you didn't ask about, and all these things.
Right. Well, and I mean, the fact that we started with the means end as our method, that's going to get you certain results.
Right.
Yeah, it's a good point.
Like we didn't ask about their history, we didn't ask how they got there or anything like that.
Yeah. I mean, but that's the thing about research, right? There's no one research
that solved all the answers
that's ever going to answer all of the questions that could potentially be answered in a given project. And anybody who comes and tells you that they have done that is lying or delusional or both. I mean, that's always possible. So, I always think that's really interesting,
But I do appreciate that these do have like fairly practical application, both for individuals who are trying to make decisions about like what do I want to do? And then again, for those of us who might be counseling though, or trying to advise or mentor people who are trying to make decisions about what they want to do. It does provide a framework to say like, well, let's think about it in these terms. And, does this help you kind of solidify or crystallize in your own mind what your priorities are? And, no, that doesn't resonate with me, or okay, yeah, that really does. Because I think all three of us were like, yep, that's me. Yep, that's me.
Well, and
so
I think
the actual participants.
Yeah, I think the work in, professional identity formation is also really relevant to this, because for individuals who are trying to figure, maybe they're on the fence about something, if they were to sit down and think about it in terms of self-determination, autonomy versus competence specifically, and they're like, I really want to do an internship. Everybody's telling me I should do an internship. I should do this, and they're like, but man, something about that doesn't feel quite right. Maybe that would give them the language to say to themselves and to others, look, I really appreciate that you want me to do this internship, but I really need this autonomy. I really need this opportunity to go out and do X, Y, or Z, or vice versa, right? Like you're telling me I should go into practice and that I shouldn't pursue an internship because of X, Y, and Z, but I don't think I'm going to be happy in my career unless I have the opportunity to become more competent and to really become an expert and really be valued by my peers as an expert. So I'm going to do this no matter what you tell me. And it might help them with that sort of sense of confidence in making the right decision for themselves too.
For themselves, because there's not a right or wrong, right? Like both of
Exactly.
them are equally valid. This is totally fair. This isn't better or worse. These are your reasons. And like I said, if it can help them verbalize that, I think that can be really powerful.
And I
So
think that can be really helpful in aligning, like getting rid of some of that cognitive dissonance and aligning their ability, like gives them the ability to align their potential career path with something that's going to make them feel like they're doing the right thing rather than, you know, just kind of going with the flow or doing what other people tell them they think they should do. So, and that's a big part of professional identity formation, right? Is like knowing who you are and what you think you want to do and being able to pursue that. So there's all kinds of really cool stuff that
love that. That's a great
it does make me wonder if there might be a role for these questions for a practical survey sort of thing. Like, so what do you want to do with your life? You know, that wasn't what it was built for though. And I'm always suspicious about, you know, misusing things. But yeah, it seems like it worked for, you know, better or worse. And so we don't really have a follow-up um, in this line of inquiry. I kind of ran out of steam and ideas, frankly, but I'm sure there's more there.
Yeah.
Well, we've just given you about 42 of them, so
That's true.
Well, if we can bring it full circle, if somebody listening would like to take this and pick the ball up and carry it down the field, right? That's also a great way to say, wow, this was really fascinating to me, and here's the next steps. And that's also a great way to keep the research going, and again to fuel ideas. So just want to bring it full circle.
I mean, I'm actually working on a research project with Shane Lyon right now that's looking at feedback and doing some qualitative analysis and could potentially, you know, circle back. So you never know.
I like it.
Always fun. Very cool. Thanks, Erik.
This was great, Erik. Yeah, I really like, and I like having the two together. I think that was a really nice opportunity to see how research can build, one to the other, and in this case, nicely, support things. But that it would have been equally cool if it had been like, oh, and this was surprising and different. But and also just a really important topic and something that I think is useful for those out there. So yeah,
cool.
Thanks to you and all your co-authors for the work you did.
Yeah.
Awesome. So another good show, and thanks for listening. And yeah, we'll catch you all next time.